Greetings, fellow painters! Today we have a short video discussing rattle can spray paints, primers, and varnishes. I use these quite frequently in my miniature painting, so I thought it would be a good idea to go over some tips, tricks, as well as some pitfalls to avoid so that you'll all end up with happy, healthy miniatures. I'm including one tip that will guarantee that you never end up with a sticky miniature again. Welcome to Treehane Miniatures. Not only do I use rattle can paints for the half-chop method of painting miniatures, but we also have a few videos coming up that will showcase using standard rattle can paints for OSL effects. So this video is going to be an important reference for when those videos go live. One question about rattle can paints: should you just use what you have lying around? Personally, I love this idea. Use what you have, be frugal. However, there are essentially two things that I take into consideration when using a can of spray paint to paint miniatures: the type of plastic that the miniature is made of, and the type of paint that is in the can. Now, this video is not going to be loaded with technical jargon, no polymers, hydrocarbons, or molecular bond talk, nothing about PVC or ABS blends. This video is going to be made up of anecdotal evidence from my own personal experience with specific paints and game miniatures. When looking to use spray paints on miniatures, the first thing that I need to decide is whether I want to start with a primer alone or a paint and primer in one. This decision is driven by how I'm going to approach painting the miniature. Am I painting with a traditional approach like base, shade, highlight, or layering? Or am I planning to use the spray paint as a shortcut like I do with my half-chop painted miniatures? If I'm planning to take a more standard approach to painting, I'll choose a flat primer every time, almost always black, but on rare occasions I will use white or gray flat primer. If I'm using the spray paint as a shortcut, I'll always choose a paint and primer in one. This is primarily because the shortcut I'm using usually entails leaving the spray paint visible on at least some parts of the model. I find that not only do paint and primer in one paints come in much more attractive colors, but the product dries to a nicer, more aesthetically pleasing finish than primers do. After all, standard primers are designed to be painted over, whereas paint and primers in one are designed to be the finished paint layer. There seems to be some fear in the hobby space that using spray can primers will inherently obscure the details of your models. I personally haven't found this to be true. I've even gone as far as to fully zenithal prime miniatures with 3 complete coats of spray primer with no noticeable ill effects, as seen on these Blood Rage miniatures. I painted these in 2019 using Sarastro's painting guides. These are the models that got me started looking beyond the typical base, shade, highlight approach to painting miniatures. I apologize for the low quality, 1 megapixel images from my Fisher-Price phone that I had at the time. When zenithal priming miniatures now, I do take a more cautious approach. I will spray the black just from the bottom and then follow up with gray from above, rather than doing complete coats of paint with each color. You can also see from the Zombicide miniature that is primed with Rust-Oleum double coverage flat black that the details are just fine. When using spray primers, it may look a little scary when the paint is first going on, but once it dries, it shrinks into the recesses, revealing all of the details. If any of you have horror stories about spray primer destroying the details of your minis, please share them in the comments down below. And if so, also tell us what paint you used. Since I'm bringing this topic up because we have some cheating OSL videos in the queue, and we have a history of posting half-chop videos using colored spray paint, I'm going to focus on paint and primers in one now. There are only 2 types of spray paint that I would consider for plastic minis. Those that specifically say for plastic, and those that say also bonds to plastic. I feel much more confident in and have had more consistent success with paints that specifically say for plastic on the label, like Krylon Fusion paints. The paints that say also bonds to plastic, like Rust-Oleum double coverage, instill less confidence in me. It's almost like using it on plastic as an afterthought. Like, oh yeah, I guess you can use it for that too. So now you're probably thinking, well then why even talk about those paints? Why not just use the Krylon Fusion paints on everything? And the answer is that double coverage Rust-Oleum paints come in finishes that are easier to paint over. I strictly buy these paints locally, and it seems that Krylon Fusion is only available in gloss finishes, whereas I can easily find the Rust-Oleum in finishes like satin. Ultimately, my choice of paint brand comes down to the type of plastic that I'm painting. I'm only considering 2 types of plastic: hard plastic and soft plastic. I'm not researching PVC or ABS concentrations here. This is primarily a board game miniature painting channel, so I'm sticking to those classifications. Examples of soft plastics that I've encountered are from games like War of the Ring, Hero Quest, and Funko games such as Horrified or Back to the Future. The harder plastics are from companies like Come On or Awaken Realms. Then of course, you have the better plastics, like those found in tabletop miniature games like Warhammer. Generally speaking, I'll use Rust-Oleum double coverage paints for miniatures from CMON, Awakened Realms, and the like. I prefer to use the satin finish, which I feel is about the smoothest finish that is still suitable to paint directly over. But even here, results can vary within the same paint brand and the same set of miniatures. For example, I tested 2 similar paints from Rust-Oleum and 2 similar promo minis from Zombicide. The Claret Wine painted Union Worker was completely dry and ready to handle after about 4 minutes. The Aubergine painted Union Worker was still very tacky even 4 days later. At this point, it's not that the paint isn't dry, it's that the solvents in the paint are reacting with the plastic. Paints are kind of like the people in your life. If you find them to be tacky at first, that's probably never going to change no matter how much time you give them. Both of these paints were brand new, purchased at the same time and from the same store, and this was the first time that they were being used. I did notice that the Claret Wine states that it's for wood, metal, plastic, and more, and that the Aubergine has the also bonds to plastic statement on it. I don't know if the Claret Wine verbiage just represents a recent repackaging of the double coverage paints line, or if it is actually better formulated for plastics. If it's my first time using a specific paint, I'll test it on a single miniature before committing it to a full game. I did that with these 4 Zombicide miniatures, all with different results. The Claret Wine is the standout, drying immediately and perfectly. The Aubergine remained tacky and will probably have to be stripped. The Grape paint was completely dry after about 1 day, and the Colonial Red was ready to go after 2 days. I only continue to use and recommend to you paints that dry immediately for me. The Rust-Oleum Midnight Blue double coverage is one of those paints. It's a staple for my moonlit half-chop style. For soft plastics, I only use Krylon Fusion paints. I learned a hard lesson when painting the War of the Ring board game. I jumped in head first and immediately primed up all 42 miniatures of Sauron's army with my trusty go-to Rust-Oleum double coverage flat black primer, and it turned into a huge sticky mess. I'd been using this primer for so long without issue that it didn't even occur to me to test it on this cheap soft plastic. That was a miserable experience having to strip 42 tiny miniatures. I use and would recommend Simple Green for stripping miniatures if needed. A day in Simple Green plus a toothbrush works wonders for stripping miniatures. In this case, I got scared and switched to using a Vallejo primer through an airbrush, but going forward I started using Krylon Fusion on miniatures that I wanted to batch paint fast. I painted up 78 miniatures for the board game Hyperborea and base coated each faction in its primary color using Krylon Fusion. I only had to paint flesh and some details like belts and weapons after that. The main thing to keep in mind when using a gloss paint as a primer for your miniatures is that you're going to want to use a clear matte varnish before you start applying additional acrylic layers. The paint needs something to adhere to, and a gloss finish just doesn't provide enough tooth for that. I'm following up my primer experiment by hitting the same 4 miniatures with Tester Spray Lacquer, which I believe is also known as Dull Coat. This will make the gloss grate paintable now. Mostly, I wanted to see if this would help the stickiness of the Aubergine, which it initially has. I have no idea what's happening under the surface at this point, so do not take this as a recommended remedy for sticky primer. I'll give an update on that in a future video. Speaking of clear coats, I'm going to share 2 more lessons that I've learned. Are you one of those people when you hear that Sara Lee Company makes Walmart Great Value white bread, you say to yourself, why would I pay for Sara Lee white bread when I could get Great Value white bread with the exact same ingredients for a fraction of the cost? Well, I'm one of those people. So when I saw that Tester Spray Lacquer has the Rust-Oleum logo on it, I could not wait to go find the cheapest Rust-Oleum clear matte spray lacquer that I could find, which I did in this Watco branded spray lacquer. It has to be the same thing, right? What a huge mistake. I clear coated all of my Blood Rage minis with this, with fine results at first, but over time that started to change. The most offensive results can be seen on this poor snow giant. The snow started out a pristine white, but gradually began to yellow. Now it looks like the snow giant has a case of the Hershey Squirts, and the gorgeous Galgulbegan mountainside is paying the price for it. The lesson here, don't be cheap. The clear matte spray coat that I recommend is Krylon Matte Finish with the number 1311 on it, or 1311. The second lesson that I learned was when I used this Treehouse Studio Clear Acrylic Matte coating, but this results in a cool tip for you. I painted 70 plus miniatures using acrylic paints for the succinctly titled Magic the Gathering Arena of the Planeswalkers Shadows over Innistrad board game. I then clear coated them with the Treehouse matte coating, but the clear coat turned to a gummy mess while in storage. One day I pulled it out and all of the miniatures were sticky. I decided to strip them and start over. Luckily at this time, I was still new to the hobby and I didn't have any idea how to properly strip paint from a miniature. I had experience with oil painting and some supplies on hand, so I decided to soak the defiled miniatures in mineral spirits to strip them. Now, you're probably thinking, idiot, but wait, this has a happy ending and not the kind that you have to pay $100 for. If you've been in the hobby for a while, you know that odorless mineral spirits don't impact acrylic paints. So what happened in this situation, even though this was an acrylic clear coat, the mineral spirits eliminated all the sticky goo that the clear coat produced and left the original acrylic paint unscathed. I just gave the minis a quick rinse and dry and reapplied a better clear coat. No stripping, no repainting. I absolutely would recommend this method if you ever find yourself with a sticky clear coat. What do you have to lose? And finally, the one tip that will guarantee that you never end up with a sticky miniature again. And you can go ahead and call me an asshole in the comments for this one, but get yourself an effing airbrush. Or I guess you could just brush the primer on, but using a bottled primer through an airbrush eliminates the solvents found in spray paints that can interact negatively with the miniature plastic. It's that simple. In addition, this will also allow you to prime indoors during inclement weather. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this rant about spray paints. We're going to apply these ideas to plenty of miniatures in upcoming videos. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of painters.